Not long ago, the European Union approved a loan for Ukraine in the amount of 90 billion euros, and today the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, finally explained where this money will be spent. The office of the President of Ukraine has already decided what to spend the first tranche of the loan on, which the country will receive in the coming days. At the same time, experts say that unfortunately, as early as next year, in 2027, Europe will most likely have to look for a new loan for Ukraine. And on this occasion, the New York Times published a somewhat sobering article in which the authors write that Europe is preparing for a prolonged Russia's war against Ukraine as it increasingly doubts the possibility of a negotiated settlement between Moscow and Kyiv. This means, according to the authors, that Ukraine is largely left alone in a war of attrition against Russia without a clear strategy for ending this war. My name is Allocation. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. In addition, subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So let's start with the loan. The President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, stated that the first tranche from the European Union as part of the 90 billion euro loan will be spent on weapons production and protection of the energy sector. Here is his quote. The first tranche under the approved European support package of 90 billion euros will be directed toward domestic production to protect Ukraine. This includes drones and all areas of Miltech. The second area is energy. By next winter, we need to protect as much as the state can possibly protect. For this, in addition to local budgets, a portion of funds is allocated that we can provide from the central budget. The funding will also come from these tranches from the 90 billion packages. We plan to allocate several billion from them specifically to protect the energy sector. This issue was discussed with European leaders in Cyprus. And against this backdrop, the Wall Street Journal writes that the European Union may face the need to approve a new loan for Ukraine as early as 2027. After all, Kyiv's funding deficit continues to grow. Although the signed loan agreement for 90 billion euros was supposed to cover 2/3 of Ukraine's budget and defense funding needs until the end of next year. But this money may not be enough. And now, a quote from the Wall Street Journal. According to diplomats, Ukraine's funding deficit for next year has increased compared to the initial estimates. Kyiv will need at least an additional 19 billion euros to cover budget expenses in 2026. This means that EU leaders may potentially have to seek another loan worth tens of billions of euros in 12 months. And it's important to remember here that Ukraine has become more dependent on the European Union as the administration of President Donald Trump stopped providing direct military aid and focused on conflicts in the Middle East. And now Europe is preparing for a prolonged war in Ukraine as it believes less and less in the possibility of a negotiated settlement between Moscow and Kyiv. As the New York Times claims, this means that Ukraine is largely left alone in a war of attrition against Russia without a clear strategy for ending this war. Next, I'll quote the New York Times. Neither Ukraine nor Russia has an obvious path to victory, and almost no one expects that an agreement is possible without the active involvement of the United States and without pressure on Russia, pressure that President Donald Trump applies reluctantly. At the same time, there is no other mediator who has enough influence on both sides to make them sit down at the negotiating table. 15 months after Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours, the situation has actually returned to the same point where the negotiations began. And here, let's be honest, it was obvious because only Donald Trump and his team didn't understand that the interests of Ukraine and Russia are incompatible, and that the only realistic course is to support Ukraine in order to prevent Russia from winning either militarily or politically. And now I would say that Zelensky has finally lost his illusions about support from Donald Trump and now evaluates the position of the United States differently. That's exactly why all these visits to the Middle East, Europe, and even Azerbaijan are happening. Zelensky is building something new, but there's a problem here. Ukraine and Europe can't refuse to work with Trump and the United States as a whole. Europeans hope that Vladimir Putin will eventually agree to lock in some gains on the battlefield and move to negotiations, but they admit that Putin wants to negotiate with Washington, not with Brussels. That's why Europe is interested in the United States returning to an active role, but with pressure not only on Ukraine but also on Russia. And analysts note that because of Europe's support, Zelensky does not need to reach an agreement at any cost this year. And the situation at the front may change, but according to estimates, Russia will suffer heavy losses for insignificant territorial gains, while Ukraine has financial support for at least 2 years. At the same time, economic pressure on Moscow has partially eased due to rising energy prices because of that war, the war that Trump started in the Middle East. As a result, neither side, neither Russia nor Ukraine, feels a critical need to end the war immediately. On the other hand, Ukraine has achieved some success in damaging Russian oil infrastructure. However, as is acknowledged in Europe, once again, there is still no clear strategy for victory. The idea was to create enough pressure on Russia, but so far, let's be objective, Ukraine has not received enough resources for this. And now it seems that the main goal is to keep Ukraine in the game until something changes in Russia itself. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or paid subscription. Subscribe and like в описании к этому видео или по QR-коду на ваших экранах. Буду благодарен за любую вашу поддержку. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.